Hello and welcome back to AP World History and Modern. Today we're going to begin day 2 of topic 6.2, State Expansion, and we're going to specifically look at American Empire. All right. And so kind of just a quick review. So we've been looking at imperialism. We talked about Africa in our last session and what happened as a result of the meeting that happens in Berlin, right? The Berlin Conference. In 1884 into 85, right? And we also briefly mentioned the different types of imperialism that we talked about as far as Europe is concerned. When it comes to European imperialism, there are a couple of different categories of analysis that you could possibly use if you're ever having to write an essay about state expansion. These are justifications used by European powers in order to justify imperialist occupation. So I'm just going to run through these real quick, and then we'll come back and we'll do these in more depth later. So one example is the occupation for humanitarian intervention. Right. So Zanzibar is taken over. It becomes a protectorate, at least for about 25 years, and then eventually it goes under direct rule in the 18 teens. And the justification for this was to abolish slavery. A second reason used, so another category of analysis for imperialism, would be occupation for resource extraction, and we're going to see this in the Belgian Congo, initially for ivory, and then eventually for rubber extraction. Another justification used for imperialist occupation is to protect free trade. We see this in the case of China, the Qing dynasty of China in the 1830s, the Opium Wars. Right, so England would go to war in order to protect its trade, its free trade interest. Okay, and then occupation to protect strategic interests, and that strategic interest is what was used in 1882 to justify occupation of Egypt. Okay, in order to protect its right to the Suez Canal. The United States, Russia, Japan, they're all going to expand by conquering and settling neighboring states. Right, so it's going to be a little different, right? And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the expansion of the United States. And so we looked at this in class, or I typically look at this in class, and we kind of just look at the rise of the United States. So what I ask students to do here is, simply look at this and tell me what the main idea is, of the person who created this, right? And obviously we can see here a lesson for anti-imperialists, showing how Uncle Sam has become expansionist first, last, and all time. Right. So, once you know what the main idea is, come up with a claim for this. Right. Come up with an assertion for this, and just looking at this, right? So to help you, because you might not be able to see this on your end. So this starts off with the United States, 1783, the end of the American Revolution, and the next date here is 1803, right? So, and what are we seeing here? The Union, right? The Union exists of 7 states. And by 1803, we see Jefferson purchasing the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon by that point. 1819 now, right? So we have 22 separate states. Spain had just been acquired from, Florida had just been acquired from Spain, right? And our next date here is 1861. So on the eve of the U.S. Civil War, there are 34 states, right? So Texas, this is, by the time we get to 1861, Texas and New Mexico and Colorado and California, Nevada had all been acquired through the Mexican-American War, right? And so we are bi-coastal by the time we get to 1861, all right? And then by 1898, the 48 contiguous, right, states are together at this point. Right, so the lower 48, right, and this is also the year that Hawaii is annexed, right? So, right, by the time we get to 1898, right, is there any other kingdoms or states that have grown in a similar fashion? Right, and for the most part, students in class generally get Russia pretty quick, right? So the eastward expansion of Russia into Siberia is very similar to the westward expansion of the United States, right? So you could classify up until 1898 the United States as a land empire, not too dissimilar from the early Qing dynasty, Russia, right? Mughal, right? That land-based expansion into its neighboring territories. Is definitely a good way to look at it. And then what changes here between 1898 and 99, right? And you can use the image here, right? And hopefully you're seeing, right? If you need a few minutes, go ahead and pause and look at it. But hopefully you're seeing that the United States is transitioning from a land-based empire to a transoceanic empire as a result of the territory acquired through the War of 1898 or the Spanish-American War. Okay, so that's what you're seeing being portrayed here. All right, here's a similar image to what we see in Africa with the British, but instead of Cecil Rhodes, right, you're now seeing Uncle Sam, and this is a reference to the acquiring of Hawaii as a territory. All right, so this is the claim, hopefully you would have picked up by now, is that American imperialism aims go back to the founding of the United States, when Jefferson calls, the U.S. the Empire of Liberty, whose job it is to spread freedom worldwide, right? And this is this idea, right, which will eventually become known as manifest destiny, that it is our destiny to spread liberty from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And we're seeing that, you're seeing this from this image. So in class, we always take a few minutes to kind of analyze this. So if you're watching this at home, please go ahead and pause this and try to identify what you think are symbolic aspects of this, and then you can unpause it and we'll go over a couple. All right, so welcome back. So hopefully you picked up on a few things, right? One of the first things that students almost always pick up on is that everyone is pushing in this direction, right, westward. What city is this? I've never really looked this painting up to really know for sure. It looks an awful lot like New York City to me, and maybe the Brooklyn Bridge. But I'm not sure. This could be the Mississippi, but right. But obviously this is not a scale thing, because we have, even if this is the Mississippi, then the Rockies here are obviously not to scale. So this is more of a symbolic image, right? Right. So what are we seeing here? So kids always notice the city. Sometimes they notice the trains. Some kids will notice the fact that she's carrying a wire. What kind of wire is this? This is telegraph. So what is Liberty carrying with her? Right, Liberty is carrying industrial era technology. And then very few kids will pick up on the coloration, right, and the symbolism that's being portrayed here. So liberty and civilization, right, the light is being shown upon the land. In the land which has not been quote civilized yet. It's dark, it's turbulent skies. There's a storm on the horizon there. Whereas the sky is clearing, where civilization has had the light of civilization has shone upon the land. You are seeing Amerindians, right, Native American populations here, also up in here, which a lot of kids don't see there. Right. So, but yeah, so this is kind of an interesting image that is often used to portray manifest destiny as a positive thing. All right. So what we'll often do in class next is we'll take a minute and we will read through this. Read through this passage. 1 second. I'm just gonna take a minute and read that. All right, so go ahead and pause it if you're not done, and we'll come back and talk about this. All right, so welcome back. When we read this, we actually read this out loud in class, and there's a couple words I just make sure that we understand. First off, what sedentarianism is, right? So what does it mean to be sedentary? That means settled in one place. The other word I want to make sure you understand, because you do see this pop up on College Board documents, is this hegemonic. Right? So what does hegemony mean? A lot of kids confuse it for homogeneous, right? It is not homogeneous or homogeneity. Hegemonic or hegemony often refers to one culture expanding beyond the borders into and being adopted by other people. So, for me to use it in a sentence, the 19th century is the era of British hegemonic influence. From 1945 into the beginning of the 21st century, America, or the United States of America, is the global hegemon. So what does that mean, right? Does it mean that there are McDonald's and KFCs and Coca-Cola all over the world in every major city? Well, the answer is kind of yes, but it's not just the businesses per se, it's what those businesses are. The fast food. But it's also things like, American movies and television and English language. People are adopting a foreign culture and foreign concepts. And why are they doing that, right? Because, you want to, it often has to do with economics, right? So people will adopt these kind of cultural things. They will learn English, even if that is not the language where they speak, because they want their children to be able to do business, with the United States. Right, and we're increasingly seeing that now today with China, where China is becoming increasingly, at least in 2021, the global hegemon, an increasing influence throughout Asia, into Africa, and the United States. Right, so you're starting to see Chinese language, Mandarin being taught more and more often in schools. You're even seeing Mandarin schools, right, where it's taught full time as part of coursework. Right, so in order to make students fluent in those languages. All right, so that's what we mean by that, right? That hegemonic people. So this here is saying that the Comanche themselves became a hegemonic people, right? Expanding, right, at the expense of surrounding societies. So other Native American groups were adopting Comanche culture, right? Abandoning their own and adopting theirs, right? And we're seeing that as well, specifically with New Spain, on the periphery of New Spain, and what eventually becomes Mexico. That's what that's referring to. All right, so that all being said, if you're not familiar with Comanche, this is a map showing the general region in which the Comanche were present. And right, we see an expansion of them. Actually, there's a couple ways you can look at it. One is, why do they push their settlements in this direction, but why don't they ever push their settlements, towards the Mississippi River? And one can make an argument that they came into contact with a force in which there was parity, a military parity. Right, so they were unable to settle beyond this particular region, and there was no such obstacle as they pushed their way into what is today California. All right, and as New Spain comes to an end, and we see that transition into Mexico, you're going to see an expansion into former territory of New Spain, by the Comanches. All right. So here's kind of the question that we look at in class is identify one way in which the author challenges commonly held assumptions about the Americas in the age of European colonialism. All right. And if you're looking for a hint on that question, maybe think about this. All right. Use this image for, I think this is a pretty safe bet that this is probably the commonly held assumption that you probably have about manifest destiny and westward expansion. So how is the author challenging that commonly held assumption that you personally might have, or maybe you're enlightened and you assume other people might have about European colonialism? All right, so please, if you are doing remote learning, please email that to me. Okay. Next, in class, we kind of just go over this really fast because your Strayer homework does deal with this pretty well. In your text, when you think about the phrase, kill the Indians, save the man, that's the section of the homework that I'm referring to here. So in class, I'll read this out and then I'll ask students to contextualize this. I'll just do this really quick. Please feel free to, try to try to contextualize what's going on around the time of this statement. All right. So this is an address to Congress by President Andrew Jackson. It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of Indians beyond the white settlements is approaching to a happy consummation. So what event in history is going on around this time? Almost everyone knows that this is the era of the Trail of Tears, right? So the Cherokee Removal. All right. So what Strayer goes into, though, is what becomes policy after the Civil War. And so while Indian removal is, in the setting up of the reservation system is definitely part of the policy of the U.S. government towards Native American groups before the Civil War, things change in the aftermath of the Civil War, and we see a new policy unfold towards Native American groups known as Assimilation Policy, sometimes referred to as Assimilation Policy. So what is assimilation referring to? This is referring to the forcing of one group to abandon their own culture and forced to adopt the culture of the aggressor, or in this case here, the United States. And one of the ways that this was done is through boarding schools. And the Carlisle School, the Carlisle Indian School, is often used as a case study to kind of show you what was going on here. So this is one of hundreds of schools that were set up across the country, in which Native American children were taken away from their families, forced to abandon their names, their language, their religion, their culture, right, and then forced to adopt American Western American hegemony culture. Okay, all right, and of course they did a pretty amazing job at documenting this, photographically. So and this was not done to preserve it, right, to kind of show this in a bad light. I'm assuming, right, that this was done in order to kind of show Congress and government, what their money was being used for, and probably for donations as well. So they photographed the children as they came in, and then after they had been processed, right? And did this for entire groups as well. So as they would come into the school, they would photograph them. So here's a group of Apache children, right, who'd come into the school. And then this is a photograph, right, after they were given their new names and clothes and haircuts. And then here's a side-by-side, just so you can kind of see them, okay? All right. Also, while they were there, they were, educated, taught the basics, and then, of course, taught skills so that they could be integrated into American society. And have the skills necessary to enter the workforce. So, yeah. All right. So, but Story does a pretty decent job with that. So I'm gonna kind of move on and just kind of look at some other ways in which the United States grew in the 1800s. So we have the Westward Expansion, right? The eventual taking over of Native American groups and the forced assimilation of Native American groups. We've already talked about, and here's another one of those Colossus images, this time showing Uncle Sam, kind of applying the Roosevelt corollary that walks off and carry a big stick, re-strengthening of the Monroe Doctrine. Right, but one of the other ways that the United States grows beyond the Willamette Empire is through the Guano Acts. And as a result of the Guano Acts, we pick up a number of different territories in the Pacific and the Caribbean. And, there's if you're not familiar with guano, there's a couple little resources I'm going to show you real quick. First off, there's this kind of interesting cartoon, and you're welcome to pause and read this. But this just kind of tells you what guano is, and right, kind of shows you where much of it was being extracted from. And the Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru, and I always do kind of explain this to the students in class. I'm just going to explain it to you guys real quick. The Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru are it's a perfect storm or kind of a perfect set of circumstances for creating a guano mine. So how do you mine bird poop? So off the coast of Peru, you have kind of an interesting confluence of things. One is a very large bird population, that eat largely anchovies, which means their poop and their pee are very rich in phosphorus and nitrogen, right? Because of their diet. Also, because it's on the west coast of South America, it's very, very dry there. So if you're not familiar with, the Andes Mountains are in Peru, and as the moist air coming in off from the east, from the Atlantic, hits the Andes, it dumps most of its moisture. So on the east side of the Andes Mountains, you have the tropical rainforest of the Amazon basin. But as the air goes over the Andes, most of the moisture has been depleted from the air. And that's why you have the driest desert on planet Earth, the Atacama Desert on the west side of the Andes. So the west coast of South America gets very, very little rain. Hence, our bird poop can build up over the course of tens of thousands of years and harden into almost a stone-like thing. So when we talk about miners, right? So like replacement slaves to work in the guano mines, that they're literally mining guano on these islands, right? So so guano becomes a major thing. In order for the United States to take part in this boom, you're going to see William Seward, who later will buy Alaska as Secretary of State. William Seward, he's going to push through what becomes known as the Guano Island Act, or the Guano Acts, which gives any American the right to claim an island if it has guano on it, anywhere on the planet if it's not already claimed. And but eventually this phase will pass, and we've talked about the second industrial revolution being a chemical revolution. A German chemist is going to be able to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere and create artificial fertilizer by the time we get into the 1880s, 70s, and 80s. That process is going to happen. All right, so that's kind of one way of looking at it. There's a neat little video, so if you're watching this from home, you can Google this.
Neural networks gravitate the United States. Now I know.
So it's called Why You Can Claim Islands for the U.S. if they have bird poop. So it's a quick little video that just kind of runs through the history of this.
Sorry, but this is going to be another one of those episodes today.
It looks at guano.
Dollars per pound.
Looks at why it was so important.
And once they did, these islands were added to
how much money it was worth.
This is how the country ended up with places like Howland Island, a 1.5-mile long piece of land in the South Pacific, and Kingman Reef, a gathering of shells reaching no more than 3 feet out of the water. So the question was, how do you fit these places into the U.S.? These islands were not close to the U.S. Some were over 4,000 miles away.
All right, so you can see here the United States, as a result of the Guano Acts, does pick up a number of territories outside of the 48 contiguous United States. Not inhabited per se. Not many inhabited per se, but it does pick up these areas.
Away from the mainland. It didn't make sense to add them as states. Most had no permanent population. It didn't even make sense to add them as territories. The U.S. had to come up with an entirely new classification of land just for these Guano Islands, the insular areas. Any insular area of the United States was considered officially by the federal government a non-integral part.
All right, so these are the insular areas of the United States, and there's a couple in the Caribbean as well. And by being insular instead of a territory, they are non-integral, or they have no path to become a state. Okay, but we are able to claim an area for about 200 miles off their coast for any kind of benefit, if any natural gas or oil is found in that land, right? And they also do provide some strategic, like for example, Midway, as you might know or you will know, is becomes an important part of World War II. Okay, so there is some strategic value here as well in these. All right, if you're interested in guano, right, and you want a more sciencey video, there's this one. Right. And this is John Green's brother, right? And he does give you a nice, science version of what makes guano so important, And he does explain the history of it as well. So the world's bird poop obsession, and it's the SciShow. It's a pretty good little rundown of the actual like chemistry behind guano. And he also talks about the German chemist, who later synthesizes it. So we'll watch a little bit of that at the end. I can get the volume to work.
With fewer droppings to mine and the discovery of artificial fertilizer, the guano boom went bust. German chemist Fritz Haber had figured out how to fix nitrogen from the air and turn it into ammonia, which could in turn be used to develop synthetic fertilizers. These work just as well, if not better, than guano. And now we've been using...
All right, so Fritz Haber, right, is our chemist who does this. Okay. All right. So this is an additional way in which the U.S. picks up some territory. We've already talked about U.S. diplomacy in Latin America and kind of gone through some of this, how the transnational corporations also spread American hegemony during this era, and American corporate interests were protected by the U.S. military, but that is not imperialism per se. It's a soft form of imperialism. I guess you could make an argument that it's economic imperialism. But Hawaii is another one of these kind of stories, as far as how the U.S. is expanding. And I don't want to get too into depth with this. There are some really great videos out there that kind of run through this. But the story of Hawaii, as far as European and American interaction, really begins with James Cook. When he arrives in the 1770s, to the island. And as far as the American story, generally begins around the 1830s with the rise of the first American sugarcane plantation owner. And the history from the 1830s, up until the 1890s, is one of multiple constitutions, multiple governments. But there is a continuity throughout that turmoil. You're going to see the presence of their monarch, right, as a continuity. But also, you're going to see an increasing presence of American sugarcane plantation owners during that time frame. By the time we get into the 1890s, you're going to see the United States, very economically connected to the sugarcane plantations in Hawaii and vice versa. You also are going to see Pearl Harbor is already up and running by the 1890s, which means when there is a coup d'etat staged by some of the plantation owners, the U.S. Marines are going to be there to support that, which is why this is sometimes referred to as the Bayonet Constitution, the one that comes in the 1890s, right? And the new republic, from that Bayonet Constitution is going to be led by a guy named Sanford Dole. Now, Sanford Dole is not the Dole of the Dole Fruit Company. The Dole Fruit Company was founded by the brother of Sanford Dole, who will later bring in plantations. So the original story of how it becomes a territory is Sanford Dole, once he gets established, puts Hawaii on that path, and kind of makes that transition to make it a U.S. territory. So he is the guy who ushers in annexation in 1898. All right. So what the story you need to kind of understand about this is more of a demographic one, right? So as far as the ins and outs. The annexation of Hawaii is part of a bigger story of the U.S. kind of increasing its territorial expansion outside of the 48 contiguous states, and growing presence in the Pacific Ocean at this time. And there's also a demographic shift going on the Hawaiian Islands itself. And we can see, I've seen population statistics around 300,000 people when James Cook arrives. And you're going to see a pretty quick drop of that, largely due to disease, right? Not too dissimilar to what we see with other Pacific Island populations like New Zealand or even the Americas before, when the Spanish first arrived. But you're also going to see a demographic shift taking place. So with the rise of the American sugarcane plantations on the island, you're also going to see a shifting in population from almost entirely native-born Hawaiians to indentured servants coming in largely from places like Japan, right? Indentured servants. One second. Chasse-Fernald. 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 Wrong number. All right. Right. You're also going to see this is also part of a bigger migratory move that's taking place, not just for Hawaii, but also to the west coast of the United States. And I do want to introduce you to this derogatory phrase, because you do see it sometimes in the documents, coolie. Okay. So coolie, you can see the origins of it, the origins of that phrase, and it's often used to describe specifically Chinese migrants into the United States in the 1800s, and we'll talk about that again, in the last topic of this unit, when we look at reaction to migration. Okay, but just know that Hawaii is part of that demographic shift in Hawaii is part of a larger demographic shift going on by East Asian populations into the Americas. Okay, all right. Philippines, of course, is part of the other kind of thing that was brought up in that original image that we started today with, with the United States becoming a transoceanic empire. So obviously Hawaii is part of that story, but it is not part of this story, right? So the war of 1898, gives us places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines, right? And there are some really interesting videos that go over this, and we've already kind of looked at this as well in class. Previously, last week, in the last couple of videos, just understand that the us taking over the Philippines from the Spanish is going to result in an insurgency, which was not new. This had already been going on. We've already talked about the propaganda movement in the Philippines, and when the Philippines falls, to the United States, and eventually is sold to the United States. Technically, it is eventually sold. The insurgency simply continues, from what had already been existing against the Spanish, but that'll largely be pacified by the United States in 1902. If you're really interested in this, there's some interesting video links on this. But one of the best videos I've seen is this lecture, and let me just click on this if you're interested. That way you can watch it yourself. It's about an hour, a little over an hour long, I think, but it does break down the occupation pretty well. It's called A War of Empire and Frontier, the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902. And this was put on by the U.S. Army War College. And it's a real interesting, a lot of kind of tidbits, and it kind of goes through the ins and outs of the Filipino resistance to the United States. How Spain surrenders, why it surrenders. Very interesting, right? If you want a kind of a more in-depth look at this, but definitely goes beyond the scope of our class. All right. So I'm just going to tell you that it's there, and you're more than welcome to watch it. What we need to understand is that the United States, we do keep the Philippines, and we will keep the Philippines until after World War II. There will be a number of pushes and attempts to spin off the Philippines as an independent country. But for various reasons, we do keep it until the end of World War II. And then obviously the Japanese are going to occupy it during World War II as well. But once World War II is done, Philippines will be given independence. All right. Just kind of look at some more images, from this era. All right. So these are all common images used to portray the expansion of the United States into a transoceanic empire. Right. So this is obviously a very patriotic one. Right. Pro empire. All right. And right. So obviously this is on the left, you're seeing an image that is questioning, liberty, bayonet, liberty, and civilization. All right. The harvest in the Philippines. All right. Definitely another very critical critical portrayal of what the United States was doing there. All right, here's another Spanish-American War one. Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. Just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you'll feel glad to be here as they are. All right. All right, next image. Once again, another image portraying President McKinley here, right? And the decision to take the Philippines. Right, and a red letter day. Right, so the stranger, how long have you been civilized? And the native, ever since my home was burned to the ground and my wife and children shot. All right, fun for the boys. This is another very critical piece of what was going on in the Philippines. So you're welcome to pause and read. Right, and then this is a kind of a different push as well. And this is also kind of very similar to what we see with Latin America, is the United States, there's definitely people who are critical of the Philippines, people who were supportive of U.S. actions in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, saw the Philippines as nothing but a stepping ground to China, and as a way to, kind of get into China and stage things for better control of China. So this is an image, right, portraying the U.S. involvement in the Boxer Rebellion. And it is Boxer Rebellion, or U.S. intervention in the Boxer Rebellion, is similar to what we see going on in Latin America. U.S. military, entering into China as a way to protect American corporate interests, most notably is Standard Oil companies, interests who are being threatened by the Boxers who were revolting. Right, so here's another image, portraying U.S. intervention in China in the Boxer Rebellion. All right, once again, Boxer Rebellion. All right, and here we're seeing the Eight-Nation Alliance in 1900 that defeated the Boxers. Right, so Britain, U.S., Australia, colony of Australia, the Raj of India, Germany, France, Russia, Italy, right, and Japan. Right, all working together, fighting together, right, against the Boxers. All right, so that's about it for today. All right, so the United States, Russia, Japan all expand, right, by conquering, settling neighboring states, and then of course the U.S. is also going to begin a transoceanic empire once we get to 1898. All right, so that is it for today. Please email me in your SAQ response from earlier in the video. All right, sapiati.